reasons why most everyone should want to get their muscles stronger is that muscles are generally getting progressively weaker across the lifespan. So when I say getting stronger, it's not necessarily about being able to move increasing amounts of weight in the gym, although if that's your goal, what I'm about to discuss will be relevant to that, but rather to offset some of the normal decline in strength and posture and the ability to generate a large range of movement safely that occurs as we age. As I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, we just tend to lose function in this neuromuscular system as we get older. And doing things to offset that has been shown again and again to be beneficial for the neuromuscular system, for protection of injury, for enhancing the strength of bones and bone density. So there are a lot of reasons to use resistance exercise that extend far beyond just the desire to increase muscle size. Because I know many of you are interested in increasing muscle size, but many of you are not. So there's an important principle of muscle physiology called the Henneman size principle. And the Henneman size principle essentially says that we recruit what are called motor units. Motor units are just the connections between nerve and muscle in a pattern that staircases from low threshold to high threshold. What this means is when you pick up something that is light, you're going to use the minimum amount of nerve to muscle energy in order to move that thing. Likewise, when you pick up an object that's heavy, you're going to use the minimum amount of nerve to muscle connectivity and energy in order to move that object. So it's basically a conservation of energy principle. Now, if you continue to exert effort of movement, what will happen is you will tend to recruit more and more motor units with time. And that process of recruiting more neurons, more lower motor neurons, as if you recall from the beginning of the episode, these lower motor neurons are in our spinal cord and they actually dump a chemical, acetylcholine, on muscle, cause the muscles to contract. As you recruit more and more of these motor units, these connections between these lower motor neurons and muscle, that's when you start to get changes in the muscle. That's when you open the gate for the potential for the muscles to get stronger and to get larger, if that's what your goal is. And so the way this process works has been badly misunderstood in the kind of online literature of weight training and bodybuilding and even in sports physiology. The Henneman size principle is kind of a foundational principle within muscle physiology, but many people have come to interpret it by saying that the way to recruit high threshold motor units, the ones that are hard to get to, is to just use heavy weights. And that's actually not the case. As we'll talk about, the research supports that weights in a very large range of sort of percentage of your maximum, anywhere from 30 to 80%. So weights that are not very light but are moderately light to heavy can cause changes in the connections between nerve and muscle that lead to muscle strength and muscle hypertrophy. Put differently, heavy weights can help build muscle and strength, but they are not required. What one has to do is adhere to a certain number of parameters, just a couple of key variables that I'll spell out for you. And if you do that, you can greatly increase muscle hypertrophy, muscle size, and or muscle strength if that's what you want to do. And you don't necessarily have to use heavy weights in order to do that. Now, I'm sure the powerlifters and the people that like to move heavy weights around will say, no, if you want to get strong, you absolutely have to lift heavy weights. And that might be true if you want to get very strong. But for most people who are interested in supporting their muscular such that they offset any age-related decline in strength or in increasing hypertrophy and strength to some degree, there really isn't a need to lie about the Henneman size principle, which many people out there are doing, and claiming that you absolutely need to use the heaviest weights possible in order to build strength and muscle. So I'm going to explain how all of this works in simple terms. So first of all, let's just talk about what hypertrophy is and what strength changes in the muscle are. We can make this very simple as well. If this were a muscle physiology class, we would talk all about, myofibrils and sarcomeres and all that stuff. We're not going to do that. That's not the purpose of today's conversation. If you're interested in that, as well as a lot of the other information that I'm going to discuss, in more detail, I highly encourage you to check out the YouTube channel and the writings of Dr. Andy Galpin. He's a PhD and a full professor in exercise physiology. He's extremely knowledgeable in this entire area of science-based tools for hypertrophy, how strength and hypertrophy really work. His lab does everything from biopsy on muscles, working with athletes and typical folks as well. A lot of the information that you're going to hear from me in the next 15 minutes or so comes from an extensive exploration of the work that he and his colleagues have done, as well as folks like Brad Schoenfield, another academic who's superb in this whole space of muscle physiology, and from a lengthy conversation that I had with Andy, Dr. Galpin, prior to this episode. So if we want to think about muscle hypertrophy, we have to ask, what is changing when muscles get larger or stronger? And there are really just three ways that muscles can be stimulated to change. So let's review those three ways and talk about what happens inside the muscle. So there are three major stimuli for changing the way that muscle works and making muscles stronger, larger, or better in some way. And those are stress, tension, and damage. Those three things don't necessarily all have to be present, but stress of some kind has to exist. Something has to be different in the way that the nerve communicates with the muscle and the way that the muscle contracts or performs that makes the muscle need to change. So this is very reminiscent of neuroplasticity in the brain. Something needs to happen. Certain chemicals need to be present. Certain processes need to happen, or else a tissue simply won't change itself. But if those processes and events do happen, then the tissue has essentially no option except but to change. So muscles move, as I mentioned, because nerves dump chemical onto the muscles, but they move because they have these things called myosin and actin filaments. And if you want to read up on this, you can you can look on the internet. You can put the sliding filament theory of muscle contraction if you really want to go deep down that rabbit hole. It's interesting. You can learn about this in a muscle physiology class. But basically, along the length of the muscle, you have what's called myosin. And just think of myosin as it's kind of like a wire. It's like a bunch of beads and wires that extend across the muscle. I think that's the simplest way to describe it. And the myosin is surrounded by these little beads called actin. The way muscles get bigger is that basically the myosin gets thicker. It's a protein, right? And it gets thicker. So put this in your mind. If you're listening to this, or even if you're watching it on YouTube, the way to think about this whole actin myosin thing and muscles getting bigger is imagine that you're holding a bouquet of balloons, a bunch of balloons by their strings. Except you're not holding the strings all at their bottom. So the bouquet isn't nicely arranged. It's not like some balloons that are all up at the top and you're holding the strings down at the bottom. Imagine that one of the balloons is very close to your hand, another one is a little bit higher up, and so this bouquet is very disorganized. In other words, the strings extending out of your hand are all different lengths. And so the balloons are all over the place. That's essentially what myosin looks like in the muscle. And those strings are what we call the filaments. And then the myosin head is the balloon. When you stress a muscle properly, or you give it sufficient tension, or you damage the muscle just enough, there's an adaptive response that takes place where protein is synthesized, and it's a very specific protein. It's myosin. The myosin gets thicker. In other words, the balloons get bigger. So the way to think about muscle growth and the way to think about muscles getting stronger is that those balloons get bigger and the muscle gets thicker. Now, the question then should be, as always, how does that happen? I mean, the muscle doesn't really know anything about what's happening in the outside world. The way it happens is the neuron has to tell the muscle to get stronger. And it does that through what we call a signaling cascade. It talks to the muscle in terms of chemicals. It doesn't whisper to it or shout at it, hey, get bigger. What it does, it releases certain chemicals that within the muscle, there are certain chemicals released that make those balloons, as I'm referring to them, the myosin, get thicker. So let's talk about the stimulus for doing that. And if already in your mind you're imagining, oh my goodness, these balloons of muscle are going to get thick, and it's just going to spiral out of control. Don't worry about that. People invest a ton of time and energy into trying to make their muscles larger. It's actually much harder for people to do than you might think. But I do want to give one exception because it illustrates an important principle of where we're headed next. Everybody has imbalances in how muscles can grow, how well muscles can grow, or how poorly or how challenging it is for their muscles to grow. Now, many people who are afraid of like getting too bulky, for instance, are afraid of lifting weights. But I think the research shows now that everyone of pretty much every age should be doing some sort of resistance exercise, even if that's body weight exercises, in order to offset this age-related decline in muscle contractile ability, muscle strength, etc., improve bone density. There's nothing good about getting frail and weak over time. And people who invest the effort into doing resistance exercise of some kind, whether or not it's with bands or with weights or with body weight, really benefit tremendously at a whole body level, at a systemic level, as well as in terms of muscle strength. There is a good predictor of how well or how efficient you will be in building the strength and or, if you like, the size of a given muscle. And it has everything to do with those upper motor neurons that are involved in deliberate control of muscle. You can actually do this test right now. You can just kind of march across your body mentally and see whether or not you can independently contract any or all of your muscles. So for instance, if you are sitting in a chair or you're standing, see whether or not you can contract your calf muscle just using those upper motor neurons, sending a signal down and deliberately isolating the calf muscle. Okay? If you can contract the calf muscle hard to the point where that muscle almost feels like it's starting to cramp, like it hurts just a little bit. It's not going to be extremely painful, nor is it going to have no sensation whatsoever. Chances are you have very good upper motor neuron to calf control. And chances are, if you can isolate that, what they call the brain or mind muscle connection, and you can contract the muscle to the point where it cramps a little bit, that you hold a decent to high potential to change the strength and the size of that muscle if you train it properly. Now, if you have a hard time doing that, chances are you won't be able to do that. If, for instance, you focus on your back muscle, like we all have these muscles called the latissimus dorsi muscles, which basically are involved in chin-ups and things like that, but their function from a more of a kinesiology standpoint is to move the elbow back behind the body. Okay, so it's not about flexing your bicep, it's about moving your elbow back behind your body. If you can do that mentally, or you can do that physical movement of moving your elbow back behind your body and you can contract that muscle hard, chances are that you have the capacity to enhance the strength and or size of that particular muscle because you have the neural control of that muscle. This is a key feature of the neuromuscular system to appreciate as we begin to talk more about specific protocols. Because everything about muscle hypertrophy, about stimulating muscle growth, is about generating isolated contractions, about challenging specific muscles in a very unnatural way. Whereas with strength, it's about using musculature as a system, moving weights, moving resistance, moving the body. The specific goal of hypertrophy is to isolate specific nerve to muscle pathways so that you stimulate the chemical and signaling transduction events in muscles so that those muscles respond by getting larger. So there's a critical distinction in terms of getting stronger versus trying to get muscles to be larger, hypertrophy per se, and it has to do with how much you isolate those muscles. Muscle isolation is not a natural phenomenon. It's not something that we normally do. When we walk, we don't think, okay, right calf contract, left calf contract. No, you just generate those rhythmic movements. And of course, there's no reason for them to get stronger or larger in response to those movements. Let's say you were to do a kind of strange experiment of attaching 30-pound weights to your ankles and you were to do those movements. Well, if you weren't specifically contracting your calves in each step, there's no reason for the calves to take on the bulk of the work, and you would distribute that work across your hip flexors and other aspects of your musculature. Your whole nervous system seeks to gain efficiency. It seeks to spread out the effort. So you can nest this as a principle for yourself, which is if you want to get stronger, it's really about moving progressively greater loads or increasing the amount of weight that you move. Whereas if you're specifically interested in generating hypertrophy, it's all about trying to generate those really hard, almost painful, localized contractions of muscle. Now, of course, how much weight you use in order to generate those contractions will also impact hypertrophy. But I think most people don't really understand the mind-muscle connection. It sounds like a great thing, but it's actually one of the things you want to avoid if your goal is simply to become more supple or to become stronger. You want to do the movements properly and safely, of course, but it's the opposite of hypertrophy, where with hypertrophy, you're really trying to make that particular muscle, sometimes two muscles, do the majority, if not all the work. Whereas in moving force loads, in trying to generate activity of any kind, like lifting a bar or doing a chin-up or something, those so-called compound movements that involve a lot of muscle groups, if your goal is to be better at those, you want to avoid isolating any one particular muscle. Now, I know this probably comes across as a kind of a obvious duh, especially to the folks that have spent a lot of time in the gym aimed at getting hypertrophy. But I think most people don't appreciate that it's the nerve to muscle connections and the distinction between isolating nerve to muscle connections versus distributing the work of nerve to muscle connections that's vital in determining whether or not you generate hypertrophy, isolated nerve to muscle contractions, versus strength and offsetting strength loss, which would be distributed nerve to muscle connections. If ever there was an area of practical science that was very confused, very controversial, and almost combative at times, it would be this issue of how best to train. I suppose the only thing that's even more barbed wire of a conversation than that is how best to eat for health. Those seem to be the two most common areas of online battle. And the scientific literature has a lot to say about both of those things. Again, my sources for what I'm about to tell you are Professor Andy Galpin and colleagues. I know there are other excellent people out there in the field, but I really trust his work. He does very controlled studies. He spent a lot of time in this space. And what's really exciting is that in just the last 3 years or so, there's been a tremendous amount of information to come out about the practical steps that one can take in order to maximize the benefits of resistance exercise of any kind. So I'm going to talk about those, and I'm going to talk about the research. I will provide some links both to a couple of the more in-depth tutorials from Dr. Galpin, as well as some of the papers that the information I'm about to tell you stems from. There's a lot of information saying that you need to move weights that are 80 to 90% of your one rep maximum, or 70%, or cycle that for 3 weeks on and then go to more moderate weights. There are a lot of paths, as some people say, there are a lot of ways to add up numbers to get 100. There's a near infinite number of ways to add up different numbers to get to 100. And what's very clear now from all the literature that's transpired, and especially from the literature in this last 3 years, is that once you know roughly your one repetition maximum, the maximum amount of weight that you can perform an exercise with for one repetition in good form, full range of motion, that it's very clear that moving weights or using bands or using body weight, for instance, in the 30 to 80% of one rep maximum, that is going to be the most beneficial range in terms of muscle hypertrophy and strength, so muscle growth and strength. And there will be a bias. If you're moving weights that are in the 75%, 80% range, or maybe even going above that, 85 and 90%, you're going to bias your improvements towards strength gains. This is true. And if you use weights that are in the 30% of your one repetition maximum, or 40% or 50%, and doing many more repetitions, of course, then you are biasing towards hypertrophy and what some people like to call muscle endurance. But that's a little bit of a complicated term, because endurance we almost always think of as relating to running or swimming or some long bouts of activity. So 30 to 80% of one repetition maximums, it doesn't really seem to matter for sake of hypertrophy, except at the far ends when you're really trying to bias for strength. Now, it is clear, however, that one needs to perform those sets to failure where you can't perform another repetition in good form again, or near to failure. And there's all sorts of interesting nomenclature that's popping up all over the internet, some of which is scientific, some of which is not scientific, about how you are supposed to perceive how close you were to failure, etc. But there's some very interesting principles that relate to how the nerves connect to the muscles that strongly predict whether or not this exercise that you're performing will be beneficial for you or not. So here's how it goes. For individuals that are untrained, meaning they have been doing resistance exercise for anywhere from 0, probably out to about 2 years, although for some people it might be 0 to 1 year, but those are the so-called beginners. They're sort of untrained. For those people, the key parameter seems to be to perform enough sets of a given exercise per muscle per week. Okay. The same is also true for people that have been training for 1 or 2 years or more. What differs is how many sets to perform depending on whether or not you're trained or untrained. So let's say you're somebody who's been doing some resistance exercise kind of on and off over the years, and you decide you want to get serious about that for sake of sport or offsetting age-related declines in strength. The range of sets to do in order to improve strength, to activate these cascades in the muscle, ranges anywhere from 2, believe it or not, to 20 per week. Again, these are sets per week, and they don't necessarily all have to be performed in the same weight training session. I will talk about numbers of sessions. So it appears that 5 sets per week in this 30% to 80% of the 1 repetition maximum range, getting close to failure or occasionally actually going to full muscular failure, which isn't really full muscular failure, but the inability to generate a contraction of the muscle or move the weight in good form. I'll go deeper into that in a moment. But about 5 sets per week is what's required just to maintain your muscle. So think about that. If you're somebody who's kind of averse to resistance training, you are going to lose muscle size and strength. Your metabolism will drop. Your posture will get worse. Everything in the context of nerve to muscle connectivity will get worse over time unless you are generating 5 sets or more of this 30% to 80% of your 1 repetition maximum per week. Okay, so what this means is for the typical person who hasn't done a lot of weight training, you need to do at least 5 sets per muscle group. Now, that's just to maintain. And then there's this huge range that goes all the way up to 15 and in some case 20 sets per week. Now, how many sets you perform is going to depend on the intensity of the work that you perform. This is where it gets a little bit controversial, but I think nowadays most people agree, and Dr. Galpin confirmed that 10%, not to be confused with the 10% we discussed earlier, but 10% of the sets of a given workout or 10% of workouts overall should be of the high intensity sort where one is actually working to muscular failure. Now, I say not true muscular failure because in theory, you have a concentric movement, which is the kind of lifting of the weight, and then you have the eccentric portion of muscle contraction, which is the lowering. And eccentric movements, because of the way that muscle fibers lengthen and that sliding actin-myosin that we talked about before, you're always stronger in lowering something than you are in lifting it. But the point being that most of your training, most of your sets should be not to failure. And the reason for that is it allows you to do more volume of work without fatiguing the nervous system and depleting the nerve to muscle connection in ways that are detrimental. So we can make this simple. Perform anywhere from 5 to 15 sets of resistance exercise per week, and that's per muscle. And that's in this 30 to 80% of what your 1 repetition maximum. That seems to be the most scientifically supported way of offsetting any decline in muscle strength if you're working in the kind of 5-set range, and in increasing muscle strength when you start to get up into the 10 and 15 set range. Now, the caveat to that is everyone varies and muscles vary in terms of their recoverability. Depending on how well you can control the contraction of muscles deliberately, and you can actually figure that out by sort of marching. You might take 5 minutes and just kind of march across your body and mentally try and control the contractions of muscles in a very deliberate way to the point where you can generate a hard contraction. And you may have to move a limb in order to do this, by the way. I'm not talking about just mentally contracting your bicep without moving your wrist. I'm talking about doing that without any weight in hand or any band or any resistance. If you can generate a high intensity contraction using these upper motor neuron to lower motor neuron pathways to muscle, you might think, well, I should perform many more sets, right? But actually the opposite is true. if you can generate high-intensity muscular contractions using your brain, using your neurons, it will take fewer sets in order to stimulate the muscle to maintain itself and to stimulate the muscle in order to grow or get stronger. So the more efficient you are in recruiting motor units, remember Henneman's size principle, the recruitment of more motor units, which isn't just muscles, it's nerve to muscle connections. The better you are at doing that, the more you will recruit these so-called high threshold motor units, the ones that are hard to get to, the more you will kick off the cascades of things within muscle that stimulate muscle growth and strength. So if you have muscles that are challenging to contract, it's going to take more sets in order to stimulate the desired effect in those muscles, not fewer. Okay? If you have muscles that you are very good at generating force within, it's going to take fewer sets. Now, how many sets? You are going to have to determine that. It's going to depend. For those of you that are using like 50% of your 1 repetition maximum, because you're doing a lot of repetitions, you might find that 3 or 4, 5 sets will maintain the muscle. You might decide to do that once at one point in the week and then do it again, right? So if you're going for 10 sets a week, you can divide that among 2 sessions, or you can do that all in one session. The data really show it doesn't matter. There are some, differences in terms of whether or not you're trying to generate maximum intensity within a workout or whether or not you want to spread that out. But in general, resistance workouts of any kind tend to be best favored by workouts that are somewhere between 45 minutes and 60 minutes, and generally not longer than 60 minutes, because that's when all the things like cortisol and some of the inflammatory pathways really start to create a situation in the muscle and in the body that's not so great for you. So it's not a hard and fast rule, that the axe doesn't drop at 60 minutes, but it's pretty clear that performing this 5 to 15 sets per week, whether or not it's in one workout or whether or not it's divided up across multiple workouts, is really what's going to be most beneficial. And please do keep in mind Henneman's size principle and the recruitment of motor units. And remember, the better you are at contracting particular muscles and in isolating those muscles, the fewer sets likely you need to do in order to get the desired effect.